Imagine a civil war so brutal. It's dubbed by many as the bloodiest civil war in human history. Historians estimate it may have claimed up to 30 million lives. Why did it come to this? Who was involved? And what was the outcome of this monumental historical event? Our military experts are here to talk about it today. Depending on where you lived, the 19th century was a particularly dangerous time to be alive. Initiated by the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts which engulfed the entirety of Europe and inflicted over 5 million casualties, by mid-century the American Civil War and the Crimean War had chalked up another million dead. The outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War 2 decades later saw another 180,000 lives snuffed out, a bitter foretaste of the 20th century slaughter to come. Still, though you may not know it, none of these monumental wars hold a candle to the bloodiest conflict of that era, a brutal civil war which resulted in 4 times as many deaths as all of these wars combined. Yes, in an era before rampant totalitarianism, nuclear weapons, and the industrialized killing techniques of 2 world wars, between 20 and 30 million people lost their lives in a conflict that consumed 17 Chinese provinces. A staggering toll, considering it constituted 2% of the entire global population at the time, or 1 out of every 50 people on Earth. This is the story of the 14-year Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest civil war in history. It might seem strange that one of history's most cataclysmic events should start with one unstable man flunking a test, but here we are. The story begins in 1636, when the Qing Dynasty seized control of Manchuria in the northeast region of China. It only took 8 more years for the Qing to establish itself as the imperial ruling dynasty for all of China itself. China itself was in relative decline. Over the next 2 centuries, the Qing Dynasty consolidated its own imperial power, but struggled to navigate successive famines, natural disasters, and foreign interloping as Western influence spread throughout its provinces. Left vulnerable to manipulative and exploitative Western trade policies, Qing rulers were forced to increase taxes on the lower classes to stave off complete financial ruin. The problem was that most of the rural poor could ill afford their new financial burdens. Many more struggled with opium addictions, endemic amongst China's population following the drug's wide-scale introduction to the country by the British East India Company. Left with little recourse, many fled their homeland. You can probably see where this is going, but things got worse. Between 1839 and 1842, the British Empire attempted to resume its trade of opium after the illicit substance had been banned by the Qing Dynasty. A vastly profitable enterprise, the allure of continuing their opium exports prompted the British Navy to engage Chinese ships and soldiers, soundly defeating the Qing forces. The Treaty of Nanking ended what became known as the First Opium War. The lopsided compact resulted in the annexation of Hong Kong by Britain, stipulations that the Qing pay $21 million in reparations, and the continuation of the opium trade. It also further destabilized a region whose government was becoming increasingly incapable of managing the turmoil within its own borders. Economic and political upheaval bred religious fanaticism. Extreme religious groups organized crime syndicates to restore order to their communities, using secret societies to bypass the authority of local administrators. It didn't help that those rulers were themselves led by a corrupt Qing government, neglectful of the seedlings of rebellion being sown across the southern regions of their vast empire. Their many displaced Han Chinese still resented the Qing, a Manchu dynasty from the northeast, for overthrowing their forebears and suppressing their traditional cultures. In fact, it was there in southern China where a man by the name of Hong Xiuquan was born in 1814. Remember the guy who flunked his test? Well, Hong's your man. The spark that would ignite a bloody powder keg under the Qing dynasty itself. Hong was encouraged by his family at a young age to embark on a career as a government official. Hong's family sacrificed a lot for him to get the education and the training he needed to pass the Confucian civil service exam. His parents were part of the Hakka, a marginalized Han Chinese subgroup from the south with their own distinct cultural traditions, language, and customs. Their ancestors had fled social unrest, upheaval, and invasions in Manchuria and sought refuge in the southern Cantonese provinces under Qing rule. In an era where there was very little social mobility for people like the Hakka, the civil service examination offered an opportunity to bring wealth, honor, and prestige to Hong's family. And so, at age 13, he left his home for the provincial capital of Guangzhou to take the exam. He failed, but it wasn't the end of the world. There was a 1% pass rate after all. with just 1 in 100 candidates passing the exams. Doubling down on his future, he became a school teacher and continued to study for the test in his spare time. Twice he returned to the capital to retake the test. Twice he failed. It had been 10 years since his first attempt, and Hong had had enough. Returning home in 1837, he suffered a nervous breakdown. And here is where things get, well, strange. During his breakdown, he began to hallucinate that he had been visited by 2 holy men, one with a golden beard and the other introducing himself as an older brother. They told Hong in his fever dream that he was consumed by evil spirits and he had to resist them to free his soul. Hong had other divine visions too. In one, he was journeying to a heavenly land in the east when he was warned by his own father that demons were destroying humanity. Hong saw himself and his brother wielding a sword in defense of his people. He eventually triumphed over the king of hell himself and was given a just reward, a place in heaven with a wife and a happy family, and the illustrious title Heavenly King, Lord of the Kingly Way. Naturally, each time Hong awoke from one of these visions, he was more and more confused. He tried to go back to his teaching gig but still felt unsettled. Perhaps he'd give the civil service examination one more college try. And so in 1843 he took it again and promptly failed. It was a dark time for Hong, and so he sought comfort in religious literature. Christian missionaries had given him some material to read on one of their previous visits. It was only then, as he read, that he began noticing connections between the things in the Christian literature and his visions. The golden-bearded man, he maintained, had in fact been God, the kind older brother, Christ himself. If God was his true father, that made him a brother of Christ. Only for Hong, he took it just a bit further. Hong Xiuquan believed that he was the brother of Christ, the second son of God sent to China to save its people from demons and evil spirits hiding within the ruling Qing government. Following his conversion, he began spreading his own teachings, a journey that would ultimately impact the future of China itself. The time was ripe for Hong's crusade. China's population had nearly tripled since the Qing Dynasty came to power, and various marginalized groups were seeking spiritual and physical outlets for their repressed ambitions. Followers weren't hard to come by. Many of them identified with Hong's vociferous anti-Qing Taiping Heavenly Kingdom pedagogy, a group that he had created, also known as the God-worshipping Society. A radical Christian offshoot, Hong's teachings selectively glossed over Christ's New Testament injunction to forgive and forget, preferring instead the wrathful tone of the God of the Old Testament. Hong's belief in his divine calling meant that he exacted steadfast devotion from each of his followers. Banned were the Qing traditions of slavery, foot binding and prostitution. Opium, adultery, alcoholism, and gambling were likewise prohibited. Hong had been preaching his Taiping form of Christianity for over a year when his followers started to expand the scope of their ire. In 1849, they started to go around and destroy every temple statue they could find, decrying their existence as objects of idol worship. Things got more intense over the next 2 years. More followers joined the movement, most of them Hakka peasants, and Hong's movement began accruing martial traits. He forged his disciplines into a literal army, with rules and regulations on how they were to act both on and off the battlefield. They were promised untold heavenly rewards in exchange for their obedience. As faith in Hong's leadership grew, and faith that someday they could overthrow the Qing tyranny, so too did the roles of his army. Hong was just 37 when his religious movement reached critical mass and ignited a full-blown revolution. In 1851, his organization officially became the Taiping Tianguo, or Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. An ironic name, as all of China soon found out. Hong maintained his position as the spiritual and intellectual head of the church. In January, the Taiping Rebellion officially began. In the southern province of Guangxi, 10,000 men attacked and surprised Qing forces in present-day Guiping, expelling them from the region. Qing attempts to launch a counterattack failed. The Taiping army had won its first battle, and faithful followers flocked to Hong's cause. 9 months later, in September 1851, Taiping soldiers were again on the move, marching north and confronting the Qing soldiers sent to stop them. Winning a series of battles, Hong's forces made their way to the Yangtze River by 1852 and were abruptly ordered east along the waterway before capturing Anqing by February 1853. Military success was paralleled by massive growth. Disenfranchised poor saw the men and women of Hong's movement as equals, brothers and sisters with the responsibility they maintained of having all things in common. Building on these primitive communist values, the origin point for modern Chinese communist and nationalist movements, Hong's powerful message appealed to those who had seen their lands and taxes mismanaged and mishandled by the Qing elite. This ensured he not only had plenty of emotional and spiritual support, but that his army remained in fine fettle for years to come. Everyone who joined was considered a soldier in Christ. It didn't matter how much money they had or where they lived. Of course, the Qing didn't realize the volatility of Hong's growing movement until it was too late. Millions of followers had flocked to the Christian armies marching across China in just a few short years. By 1852, the Heavenly Kingdom and Hong, its heavenly king, posed an existential threat to the dynasty. That year, it sought assistance from an unlikely ally, the Triad organization. This secret society possessed many cells in the southern regions where the Heavenly Kingdom was operating. They saw many similarities in the way Hong's revolutionary organization operated and their own family-based syndicate. Perhaps they could leverage Qing support and seize much of the power of the Heavenly Kingdom in the south. It was a long shot, since by 1853 the Heavenly Kingdom could already boast a following of more than 2 million people. They went to Nanjing and laid siege to the city. Convinced that its Manchu residents were all demons, Hong gave his followers permission to execute all the men and burn the women alive. Fittingly, Hong had Nanjing renamed Tianjing, or Heavenly Capital. Its loss was a big blow to the Qing. It had been a thriving administrative center and thus represented a huge loss of prestige. If an imperial dynasty couldn't stop Hong's homegrown grassroots military movement, who could? Predictably, more supporters joined Hong's cause, upping the ante even more. The Heavenly Kingdom had its sights set firmly on Beijing itself, the heart of the Qing dynasty. It would employ fanatics and zealots, entire divisions of women soldiers, and keen strategists alike, as Hong contemplated the conquest of northern China. Things looked good by mid-decade. By 1855, Hong had created a buffer state between the south and the north. Yet it didn't take long for his fortunes to unravel. Qing forces started to correct course, running the Heavenly Kingdom back to Tianjing and encircling the city in a brutal siege. Then the British and its Western friends intervened, and the Second Opium War broke out, a troubling distraction for the Qing ruling class. The battle against the Heavenly Kingdom would have to wait. They had to make sure that they could protect Beijing from foreign oppression. While that didn't go according to plan, things weren't all peachy in Hong's court. Functionaries and leaders began to disagree with one another, questioning Hong's decision-making and cognizant of his declining mental facilities. A power struggle ensued, with Hong's advisors and generals vying for control of the Heavenly Kingdom. Fearful of a coup, in 1856, Hong used his divine power and absolute authority to purge his court of conspirators. As hundreds of his inner circle were brutally murdered, Zhang Guofan, an ambitious Qing general, led a force of local recruits called the Hunan Shang Army into western China to confront the Taiping forces. Zhang managed to retake Wuchang, a place where Hong's followers had mercilessly slaughtered over 40,000 people, eventually pushing Hong's forces back until all of Jiangxi was secured by 1856. Rampant instability in the Heavenly Kingdom convinced some that time was up for their divine ruler. One of them was his cousin, Hong Rengan, who by 1859 felt Hong's radicalism made the movement completely incompatible with spreading Western values. Rengan envisioned a more democratic, egalitarian, and indeed Christian movement, one which could gain Western sympathy, engage in Western trade, and promote the education of the illiterate masses with sweeping reforms. Rengan had been one of the earliest converts to the rebellion, but his radical views required him to seek refuge in Hong Kong, where he had developed his pro-Western attitudes. While Hong Xiuquan remained in power, Hong Rengan resorted to promoting his ideas to a smaller group, both in and out of Tianjing. While Hong Xiuquan's followers contemplated the future of the movement in light of their leader's ailing mental health, the Second Opium War officially came to an end. The Qing dynasty simply could not stop Britain and France from opening up their ports to trade while dealing with its own domestic trouble. Moreover, after economic ties were rebuilt, they found that their inner turmoil was bad for business. The Europeans felt that they could help the Qing quell their own proverbial demons. They formed a coalition of convenience, one which enabled the Qing dynasty to modernize its military forces, improve their tactics, and resume its campaign against the Taiping rebels. Things were looking up for them, but they still had a mountain to climb. In May of 1860, Taiping forces delivered a resounding blow to Qing forces, laying siege to their capital city. finally granted access to the southern Jiangsu and Xizang provinces, some of the wealthiest in the empire. They advanced east. Unbeknownst to them, Zheng's Qing forces were simultaneously advancing along the Yangtze River, deeper and deeper into Taiping-held territory. Hong's forces had another ace up their sleeve. In June of 1861, they marched on Shanghai itself. The brutal siege dragged on for well over a year, but the Heavenly Kingdom could not make inroads against the Western-trained and American-led Qing forces defending the city. The Heavenly Kingdom didn't have time to dilly-dally. Zheng's Qing army was on the move once more, rapidly gathering support as the Confucianist Chinese majority increasingly looked down on the alienating Christian message at the root of Hong's theology. Continuing along the Yangtze River, Zheng's army captured Anqing, with assistance from Britain's Royal Navy. The ring was closing around Tianjin. Left with little recourse, the Taiping military marched to confront the onrushing Qing forces, having never captured Shanghai. It was a severe blow. The movement was showing signs of crumbling. By the time Zheng's army reached Tianjin, outnumbered but better equipped and ably led, they started their years-long siege. They held the capital under Hong's leadership, but they couldn't hold it forever. 2 years later, he died. Some say he was poisoned intentionally, others say he took his own life. Regardless, the death of the Heavenly King sent shockwaves throughout the city. By 1864, when Qing forces finally entered the city, 100,000 Tianjin citizens had died in the siege, many of them committing suicide to avoid capture or surrender. The marauding soldiers immediately exhumed Hong's body, cremated it, and scattered the ashes by cannon shot to ensure the rebellion's leader would not have a resting place for his followers to visit. The game still wasn't up for the Heavenly Kingdom. Prior to his death, Hong passed his heavenly authority to his 15-year-old son, Hong Xiuquan. As it is with most teenage demigods, his lack of charisma, power, experience made it impossible to keep the movement together. Xiuquan managed to escape the siege before the fall of Tianjin. He and his advisors were eventually rounded up and executed. The embers of the rebellion burned hot across the countryside for months to come. Hundreds of thousands continued to fight for the Heavenly Kingdom against the Qing. Historians claim there were at least 250,000 Taiping soldiers in Jiangxi and Fujian alone, a formidable force which took the westernized Qing military years to whittle down. Rural regions fought on, refusing to buckle under the oppressive Qing dynasty. Revolts broke out from year to year, each brutally repressed and crushed. A loyalist by the name of Wang Haiyang led the final holdouts of the Heavenly Kingdom during their last stand in Guangdong. By January 1866, 15 years later, the revolution was dead. Vestiges of the Taiping Rebellion remained for 2 more years, but by 1868 China had officially moved on, or so they thought. The Qing dynasty won the battle but arguably lost the war. Its failure to administer its aggrieved citizens left millions destitute, poor, and restive. That social unrest would boil over. By the end of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was on its last legs. The government would try to course-correct multiple times in the early 1900s, but there seemed to be only one way forward. As the old imperial system collapsed and gave rise to national and communist uprisings, it was Mao's revolution, the self-proclaimed secular successor of Hong Kong's Taiping Rebellion, which provided the way forward for millions of benighted peasants who had once abhorred the Qing rule. What do you think China would look like if the Taiping Rebellion was successful? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.